When I told my wife that I'd been invited here today to talk about creativity within crisis, she literally stopped what she was doing and went, "Really? Why you?" I tried to explain, and she came back with, "I get it. It just seems like you're always in crisis." So that's the short version of my TED Talk, and I'll do the longer version. The playwright and novelist Somerset Maugham once said, "It's very difficult to know people. For men and women are not only themselves, they are also the region in which they are born, the city apartment or farm in which they learned to walk, the food they ate, the games they played as children, the schools they attended, the sports they followed, the poets they read, the God they believed in. And these are the things that make them what they are." I'm a firm believer in this idea, and it's for that reason I'm going to try and give you some waypoints through my life that I hope will explain why I'm standing here today, and I hope also allow you to believe a bit more in what I have to say. I don't remember much about my childhood, although my parents do tell me a story that rings true. I was 7, and they organized a birthday party for me, and I hid in my bedroom until all my friends had gone home. Not because I didn't like them, that would have been weird, but because I was a bit shy, I didn't like the attention and just preferred being on my own. To this day, my mum will sometimes remind me of that and say, "Give me the boy at 7, and I'll show you the man." That's the boy at 7, and that's my little sister Frances. I just mainly put that in there to annoy her. Avoiding people dictated my pastimes. Art and sport came out on top. Art I loved, and I could do on my own, and people would respectfully keep their distance. As for sport, anything individual, preferably not on the school curriculum, cycling in particular. The bike went with me everywhere, from the north of Scotland, the south of England, to the Far East. It gave me a freedom and space that nothing else could. And as I got stronger and more skillful, it introduced me to the thrill of fear and adventure, then speed and competition, eventually racing. Racing is the ultimate form of escapism. When you're in it, it's so pure, so simple, nothing else matters. I started with BMXing when I was 8 or 9. Then my parents got divorced when I was 11. That put everything on pause or sped it up. I'm not sure. It definitely changed everything. I decided to leave my mum and sister behind in England and move with my dad to Hong Kong. It was there that I took up mountain biking, and I did my first race when I was 14. And a couple of expat guys saw me, and they were like, "Whoa, you got to get on a road bike." And I was like, "No way. I'm not wearing lycra, and I'm definitely not shaving my legs." They didn't give up on me, though. Hats off to them. They fed me magazines, books, videos, anything they could find on road racing. It worked. I converted. I sold my mountain bike and bought a road bike. And from that moment on, I never rode alone. I projected myself into this imaginary world I'd created of European racing. I'd ride around the country parks of Hong Kong, imagining helicopters droning above, motorbikes screaming by, crowds parting in front of me, and always the peloton chasing. The seed was planted. Art became secondary, partly because I didn't think I was creative enough, mainly because with cycling I realized I might have stumbled across something I was born to do, and I'd be a fool not to try. I had that binary state of mind where it was all or nothing. Cycling got it all, and art almost nothing. I turned pro when I was 19. My rise through the ranks had been unprecedented, which was good, but it was also bad because it meant I was so unprepared for the world I'd signed up for. At my first pro race in the spring of 1997, it was made evident to me that doping was rife within professional cycling. I was heartbroken. I called my mum up from that first race from the hotel there and told her what I discovered, and I didn't know what to do, and I was scared. She told me to come home, as any mum would, but I couldn't do it. I mean, she had a point. She said, "You've got a place at art college held for you. You have another life here waiting for you. Come back." But I couldn't do it. I couldn't let cycling go. Partly because I was naive, but more, I was optimistic. I was optimistic that I'd get stronger, the sport would get cleaner, and everything would be okay. The thing is, with optimism, it's like a plant. It needs sunlight and water to survive. And the deeper I got into professional cycling, the darker it got. And as for water, there was none. It was only ever about blood. My fate was sealed, and I was oblivious to it. From the moment of discovery, I fell in love with the Tour de France. I couldn't believe that something so insane could actually exist. A race, a 3-week race around France, crossing 2 mountain ranges. Back then, only 1 rest day. To think I'd been worried about shaving my legs, I need a bloody haircut. I was enamored. I learned everything I could about it. And it soon became clear that it had been designed as a madness from the very get-go, the big brother of its time. Multiple days of curated and narrated drama scripted by the human condition. Enough of it to keep the audience coming back day after day, over and over again. It was like Love Island, Survivor, National Geographic, the Olympics all rolled into one and put on wheels. My first tour was in 2000. I was 23 years old. It was the beginning of the Lance Armstrong era. By this point, I was effectively French. I'd learned the language. I was leading France's #1 team. I lived in a small town in the southwest called Biarritz, a beautiful place. No other professional cyclists lived there, or even nearby, which was the point. I figured that if I stood any chance of holding on to my identity, keeping my value system, then I was going to have to isolate myself as much as possible from the professional cycling world when I could. That first tour was surreal. I won the first stage. I wore the yellow jersey. I was in a bubble for 3 weeks. I didn't want it to ever end. On the final day, my family and friends from Hong Kong came to Paris to watch. As I raced up and down the Champs-Élysées, one of my friends said to my sister as they leaned against the barriers, "Look at him, he's actually living his dream." The thing is, it wasn't a dream. I hadn't doped, I'd stood my ground, but I was being groomed. My team kept me on an A program of racing. They gave me leadership status. They had me on a 4-year contract instead of the normal 1 to 2. They roomed me with older riders, seasoned campaigners who knew the ropes, not the good ropes. And through all of that, they taught me how to inject myself intravenously and intramuscularly. Back then, it was normal. Within professional cycling, that's how we ingested our vitamins and supplements. It was not illegal. It was expected. Learning how to inject yourself is not fun, and it's where the gray area began for me. They talk about gateways in the world of drugs. Well, when you look down at your own hand holding a syringe and you put enough pressure on that needle to puncture your skin and you empty the contents into your body, that's not sport, and yes, it's a gateway. I won't forget the first time I did it. I was in some shitty hotel room in France and the team doctor was showing me an older rider encouraging. It fills me with sadness looking back. It just filled me with sadness then. So although I was clean, I was being taught the tools of the trade. And deep down, I knew there was a certain inevitability to my situation. I was becoming a respected name in the sport. I was on my way to becoming a genuine Tour de France contender. I could feel the weight of expectation, and it was a burden that I was finding heavy to carry. I was so deep into professional cycling now, I didn't have anything else in my life. I perhaps isolated myself too much. I didn't even have a home to go back to. Hong Kong wasn't just far away, it was distant and incompatible. As for the UK, I hadn't lived there in over a decade, and Biarritz, my port in the storm, well, it was no longer a hideaway. My Tour de France success had erased my anonymity. The irony is I'd never been better known, and yet I'd never felt so alone. The following year's Tour de France, this is 2001, I was 24, I crashed heavily on the first stage. I ended up quitting the race on stage 10. My team seized their opportunity and sent me to Italy to prepare properly for the Tour of Spain. I knew what this meant. It was time for me to grow up to become the professional I was destined to be. I couldn't fight it anymore. The optimism I'd had been withering like an unwatered plant, and it was made clear to me that it was impossible to win the Tour de France clean. I couldn't beat them, so I decided to join them. I gave up. In Italy, I stayed at the family home of an older teammate, a Tuscan villa like something out of a movie. That's where I did EPO for the first time. For those of you unfamiliar with EPO, it is to endurance sport what steroids are to sprinting. Instead of building muscle, it increases your blood's oxygen carrying capacity. It's like having altitude training in a syringe. I won more races. I continued on my journey towards ultimate Tour de France success. Except it wasn't my journey anymore. From the outside, it looked like a smooth and upward trajectory. Yet on the inside, sirens were going off, warning lights flashing, dials going haywire. I'd lost control. Where once there had been optimism and hope, now there was just shame, guilt, regret, and lies, so many lies. And the joy I'd once had, it was gone. It was just relief now when I won. Relief that I'd fulfilled my objectives, relief that I'd justified the risks I was taking. I became world champion in 2003. I was 26. On June the 24th, 2004, I was arrested by French police in Biarritz and locked up in a cell on my own for 2 days. I was intermittently interrogated by Parisian drug squad. It was horrible. Yeah, I felt like I deserved it, or what I'd done was wrong. Towards the end of the 48 hours, I had a moment of clarity. All that time alone in the cell had forced me to really look at what had happened to me and imagine that kid back in Hong Kong and think, geez. I realized from the outside it could have looked like I had everything. I hadn't had anything for a while. Even my love for cycling, which I loved so much, I now hated. I blamed it for what I'd become, the person I'd become. And so in that moment, I decided I had nothing to lose, so I told them everything. I wish I could say that was a low point. It was another year from that moment of confession till I hit rock bottom. And it was in that process that I learned something. The struggle is in the fall. Because when you're in that descending spiral, all you do is look down into an abyss and wish it to end. And then it does stop. You do hit rock bottom. And you have to make a decision. Do you lay there broken, or do you dare look up? Do you risk standing up? Well, somehow I found the courage to look up, and there it was, a ray of light, a glimmer of hope. And that's when my true life journey began. I decided to stand up. I was 28. I believe in second chances. Fortunately, others do too. My fall from grace, or rather crash and burn, had been an existential crisis in the truest sense. Yet instead of taking everything away, it gave me everything back. Being offered a second chance was like having a rope thrown down to me. A couple of years after that rock bottom moment, I was speaking at an anti-doping conference, and somebody asked me the how and why of me turning it around. And I said, without thinking, love. Because that's what it had been. It was the human condition at its very best. People choosing to take the hard option, choosing to support me, choosing to take pulls in that rope and help me climb out of the darkness. Each of us has to define our purpose, our reason to stand up. Mine was to prevent what happened to me happening to others. And I knew if I was going to do that, I was going to have to go back into the sport, do it differently, and try and change everything. I started by approaching anti-doping agencies, federations, race organizers, telling them I wanted to share my experiences, educate them, try and change their perceptions in the hope that they could start to change things. I answered every single media request and told my story over and over and over again. For the same reason, in order to try and educate the wider public of what had happened to me, that it wasn't black and white, that within professional cycling we had a fundamental cultural problem that was causing the doping. My first race back after my 2-year ban was the Tour de France. Probably not the easiest race to go back to, but in the days leading up to it, one of the biggest doping scandals in the history of the sport came crashing in like a tsunami. I became the de facto spokesman, not because I wanted to, Jesus no, but because no other rider would talk about it. I was crushed to realize that nothing had changed, but this time it didn't affect me. I had made my decisions. I was going to do it differently this time. I was going to do it the right way. I was going to do it clean. I had my moral compass essentially welded due north. I had a no-needle policy on myself. I decided that syringes were never going to touch me again unless it was a medical emergency. I had an off-the-shelf multivitamin a day. My team doctor thought I was insane. My teammates was just baffled. I finished that first Tour de France respectfully, if not gloriously. I then went to the Tour of Spain, and I won stage 14, a time trial. In the post-race press conference, the first thing I said before even answering a question was, I want young riders to see this, and believe me when I say this, I did this clean. I did it on bread and water. It's possible. I said that because it's what I needed to hear when I was younger. It would have given me the hope. It would have fueled my optimism. Because without hope, there is no optimism. Courageously, UK Anti-Doping nominated me as their candidate to the World Anti-Doping Agency's Athletes Commission. This was unheard of, definitely unprecedented. Us ex-dopers, well, we're villains, we're pariahs, we're jettisoned and forgotten about. Amazingly, WADA accepted my candidacy, and instead of the 2 years mandated, I was sat in the seat for 4 years. During that time, I was able to introduce the no-needle policy into the WADA code. I did this in a somewhat unorthodox manner. We had a meeting in Lausanne, and while the rest of the committee went to lunch, I went to a pharmacy and bought 12 syringes, 12 needles, 12 ampoules of saline solution. On the return from lunch, they found all the medical paraphernalia laid out in their places. The discomfort was palpable. I then taught them how to build a syringe, how to snap the top off a glass ampoule, siphon the contents out, roll their sleeve up, tourniquet their bicep, and imagine injecting their forearm. I said, this is not sport. No athlete should ever have to do this. This should only be for medical emergencies. After my ban, I won stages in all the Grand Tours. I was the first British rider to wear all leaders' jerseys. I won national titles on road, time trial, track. I captained world and Olympic teams. And yet, for me, my proudest accomplishment is bringing in the no-needle policy. I just wish it had been done before they taught me. 2014 was my final year racing. Apart from the racing and the anti-doping crusade, I'd also written 2 books, made 2 films, founded and co-owned a cycling team that pioneered internal anti-doping, got married, had kids. I was a bit tired. Everybody kept asking me, what's the next chapter? Well, here we are, full circle, the end of the beginning. That kid who didn't think he was creative enough, that choice I didn't take to art college, I decided to be that version of myself. And in 2015, I founded a company called Chapter 3. After all, it wasn't the second chapter. This is the final act. I wanted to create a company and brand that could operate differently within the cycling industry, be more creative, make things better, do things differently. We have no exit plan. All these things I've told you, they are my waypoints. They are better ways of knowing me, as Somerset Maugham said. And I hope it will allow you to believe me a bit more when I say this. Nothing is impossible. Now, it took me a while to grasp that concept. The little boy who would hide away in his own bedroom at his own birthday party, well, around that time, my grandma took me aside and she said, David, I want you to remember something. I don't want you to ever forget this. She said, nothing is impossible. Nothing is impossible for you. I thought she was crazy. I was like, of course things are impossible. And then a couple of months ago, I was putting our boys to bed. They're 6 and 8 years old, and one of them said, Daddy, that's impossible. And without realizing what I was doing, I pulled them over, I sat them down either side of my bed, or either side of me on the edge of the bed, and I put my arm around them, and I said, guys, I want you to remember this, and you must always believe it. Nothing is impossible. Their faces lit up. They got it instantly in the way I think my grandma had hoped I would 36 years before. The thing is, as we get older, we find it difficult to believe that anything is possible, let alone that nothing is impossible. Yet more often than not, it's in crisis when we lay there broken rock bottom and we dare look up and imagine a better future that we rediscover it. Because without imagination, there is no creativity. As the old saying goes, the darkest hour is just before the dawn. I'm going to leave you with this final picture. Remember my little sister. She's now the CEO of the world's greatest cycling team. This is her congratulating one of her riders, Geraint Thomas. She did with him, and she's worked with him since he was 19 years old, what she couldn't do for me. He won the Tour de France, and he did it clean. Nothing is impossible. Thank you.